In 1932, the average American family had lost 40% of its income. Banks were closing, farms were failing, and somehow, people still fed their families every single day. Not with what they wanted, with what they had. Today I want to show you 20 dishes that came out of that impossible situation. Some of them are heartbreaking. Some of them are genuinely brilliant. And at least 2 of them are so good, I still can't explain why we stopped making them. The Great Depression didn't just reshape the American economy, it reshaped the American kitchen. Between 1929 and the early 1940s, home cooks across the country were forced to do something that no cookbook had ever really prepared them for. Feed a family on almost nothing, day after day, without letting the people at the table know how bad things actually were. What came out of that era was a body of cooking that was equal parts desperate and ingenious. Dishes built from scraps, meals assembled from things that wealthier generations would have thrown away without a second thought. And a philosophy of food. Waste nothing. Use everything. Make it taste like something. That produced some of the most creative recipes in American culinary history. These are 20 of those dishes. Some vanished the moment prosperity returned. Others lingered for decades before quietly disappearing. All of them tell you something true about what Americans are capable of when the pressure is on. Number 20. Hoover Stew. We start with the dish that became the unofficial symbol of Depression-era cooking, and the unofficial insult aimed at the president many Americans blamed for their suffering. Hoover Stew was named after Herbert Hoover, whose promises of prosperity had become a bitter joke by 1931. The dish itself had no fixed recipe. It was whatever you had. Typically, canned tomatoes, macaroni, or any pasta available. Whatever vegetable scraps were on hand, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a small amount of hot dog or canned meat stretched across the entire pot. What made it a stew in name only was the broth, which was usually little more than tomato liquid thinned with water. It fed large families because it was designed to. You kept adding water and pasta as more mouths appeared at the table. It was served in Hoovervilles, the shanty towns that sprang up on the outskirts of American cities, and in church soup kitchens from coast to coast. Naming it after Hoover was an act of dark humor from people who had very little left to laugh about. Number 19. Mock apple pie. This one requires a moment to appreciate properly. Mock apple pie contained no apples. Not a single one. It was made from Ritz crackers, and it tasted genuinely, remarkably like apple pie. The recipe was developed and printed on the back of Ritz cracker boxes beginning in the early 1930s, when fresh apples had become expensive and scarce. The method? Crush Ritz crackers into a pie shell, cover with a syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice, add butter and cinnamon, and bake. The cream of tartar created an acidity that mimicked the tartness of apples. The texture of softened crackers under heat became remarkably similar to cooked apple slices. The cinnamon did the rest. Food scientists have since studied why this works. The answer comes down to texture and acid, 2 elements the brain uses to identify apple flavor more than actual apple compounds. It's Depression-era ingenuity accidentally stumbling onto something food technology wouldn't fully explain for 50 more years. Ritz still prints the recipe on their box today. Number 18. Cornmeal mush. Before the Depression, cornmeal mush was already a staple in southern and rural American kitchens. During the Depression, it became survival food for millions. The preparation is as simple as food gets. Cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water until thick, then poured into a dish and allowed to set. Eaten hot, it was breakfast. Sliced cold and fried in whatever fat was available, it became something entirely different. Crispy on the outside, creamy inside, substantial enough to hold a working man through a long morning. The genius of cornmeal mush was its caloric density relative to cost. A 10-cent bag of cornmeal could feed a family of 4 for several days. Topped with maple syrup, it was breakfast. Served with sausage gravy, it was dinner. The government's wartime nutrition pamphlets actively promoted it as a cost-effective energy source. It worked because it had always worked. For Native American communities for centuries, for early colonial settlers, and now for Depression-era families discovering just how far back American culinary history went when the cupboard was bare. Number 17. Dandelion salad. In the spring of the Depression years, families who couldn't afford produce did something their immigrant grandparents had always known was possible. They went outside and picked their dinner from the ground. Dandelion greens, which grow freely in yards, parks, and roadsides across most of the United States, became a legitimate food source for millions of American families during the 1930s. Young dandelion leaves, harvested before the plant flowers when they're least bitter, were washed and dressed simply. Usually a vinaigrette of white vinegar, a little sugar, and bacon grease warmed in a pan and poured hot over the greens, wilting them slightly and softening both the texture and the bitterness. What's remarkable nutritionally is that dandelion greens are extraordinarily nutrient-dense. They contain more vitamin A than carrots, more calcium than milk by weight, and significant amounts of iron and vitamin C. Families eating dandelion salad out of desperation were, nutritionally speaking, eating better than families who could afford iceberg lettuce. Nature provided. They listened. Number 16. Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie sounds like a dare. It was actually a genuine dessert that spread rapidly through Appalachian and rural southern communities in the 1930s because it required almost nothing. The filling: vinegar, sugar, eggs, butter, and a little flour. Mixed together, poured into an open pie crust, baked until set. Topped with meringue to soften the sourness and add visual elegance. The result was a custard-style pie with a sharp, clean flavor, not unlike a lemon curd tart, but without the lemon. The vinegar provided acidity. The sugar balanced it. The eggs gave it a silky texture that held when sliced. It was dessert when dessert should have been impossible. A small act of dignity at the end of a hard week that cost almost nothing. Vinegar pie has roots that predate the Depression significantly. Recipes appear in American cookbooks as far back as the Civil War era, when lemons were expensive and unavailable across much of the South. The Depression simply reintroduced it to a generation that had briefly forgotten it existed. Number 15. Potato pancakes. Potatoes were the Depression's most reliable ally. Cheap, calorie-dense, versatile, and available almost everywhere. Potato pancakes, grated raw potato mixed with egg, a little flour, salt, and onion, fried in whatever fat was available, were one of the most effective ways to turn a single potato into something that felt like a complete meal. The technique came primarily from Eastern European immigrant communities, Jewish, Polish, Ukrainian, and German families who had been making versions of this dish for generations. During the Depression, it crossed cultural lines rapidly, spreading into American households that had never heard words like latke or plaki, but understood immediately what the dish was: hot, filling, and inexpensive. Fried in bacon grease and topped with a spoonful of applesauce or sour cream, if either was available. They were genuinely delicious. Even plain, salted, eaten straight from the pan, they were enough. That was the standard. Enough. If this kind of American food history is what you're here for, and we've got 10 more dishes to get through, hit subscribe. New video every single day on Vintage Table USA. Let's keep going. Number 14. Boiled carrot sandwich. This one is hard to look at without feeling something. A boiled carrot sandwich is exactly what it sounds like. A carrot, boiled until soft, placed between two slices of bread. Sometimes with a scrape of margarine, sometimes with salt, often with nothing else at all. In the worst years of the Depression, 1932 and 1933, when unemployment reached 25%, this was what lunch looked like for millions of American children. Bread and a boiled vegetable. The carrot provided some nutrition, some sweetness, and enough bulk that a child's stomach wouldn't be empty by afternoon. Food historians who studied Depression-era school lunch records found boiled carrot sandwiches documented in school meal programs across the rural Midwest and South, served not as a curiosity, but as a standard offering when budgets allowed for nothing more. Understanding this dish doesn't require culinary analysis. It just requires sitting with what it represents. Number 13. Prune pudding. This is the Depression-era dish that made it all the way to the White House and caused a minor scandal when it got there. Eleanor Roosevelt, committed to demonstrating that the first family lived within the same constraints as ordinary Americans, famously served prune pudding at White House functions during the Depression years. The press was not kind about it. The dish itself is straightforward. Dried prunes simmered until soft, sweetened with sugar or molasses, thickened with cornstarch, served warm or cold. The flavor, to modern palates, is surprisingly good. Sweet, slightly tangy, with a deep fruitiness that molasses amplifies. It's closer to a fruit compote than what most people picture when they hear the word pudding. Eleanor Roosevelt's decision to serve it publicly was deliberate. A statement that no food was beneath dignity, and that waste, even at the highest levels of American society, was unacceptable during a national crisis. The pudding became a symbol of that position, for better or worse. Number 12. Depression-style egg drop soup. Egg drop soup, as most Americans know it, is a Chinese-American restaurant dish. The Depression-era version that appeared in rural American kitchens had a different origin entirely. A practical answer to how to make a hot, nourishing meal from almost nothing. The method? Boil water or thin broth. Beat an egg vigorously. One Depression-era cookbook described it as a forearm workout. Drizzle the beaten egg slowly into simmering liquid while stirring, creating thin egg threads that cooked instantly and turned flavored water into something with texture, protein, and a degree of richness. Add salt, whatever vegetables were available, a piece of stale bread for body. This technique, using beaten egg to enrich and thicken thin broth, appears independently across dozens of food cultures facing scarcity. French cuisine has egg-enriched consommé. Italian has stracciatella. The Depression-era American version had no name, no cultural heritage attached. It was just what you did when an egg and hot water were the only things standing between your family and an empty table. 8 more to go, and the final 3 on this list include one dish that started as Depression-era survival food and somehow ended up in fine dining restaurants decades later. Stay with me. Number 11. Cabbage and noodles. Simple, cheap, filling, and made correctly, genuinely good. Cabbage and noodles, known in some communities as haluski, was a Depression staple that fed millions across the industrial Midwest and Northeast. A head of cabbage sliced thin, cooked down in fat until soft and slightly caramelized, combined with boiled egg noodles, seasoned with salt, pepper, and a small amount of butter or bacon fat. Cabbage was among the cheapest vegetables available. A large head cost a few cents and fed a family for 2 meals. Combined with a handful of pasta, it became a complete dish that satisfied hunger genuinely rather than temporarily. Eastern European immigrant communities had been making versions of this dish for generations. During the Depression, it spread beyond those communities as their neighbors discovered how far a single head of cabbage could go. Number 10. Milk toast. The name has become a cultural insult. Milk toast entered the English language as a synonym for weakness, borrowed directly from this dish. Which is unfair, because milk toast fed a significant portion of the American population during the Depression with quiet effectiveness. The preparation takes 3 minutes. Toast a piece of bread. Place it in a bowl. Pour warm milk over it. Add a small amount of butter and salt. The bread absorbs the milk, softening into something between a soup and a porridge. It was served to children, the elderly, anyone whose stomach was too troubled by hunger or illness to handle something more substantial. It required almost no skill, almost no equipment, and almost no money. A glass of milk and a piece of bread, the 2 most basic things in an American kitchen, became a meal. On the nights when families had nothing else, they had milk toast. And on those nights, it was enough. Number 9. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Unlike some dishes on this list, creamed chipped beef on toast wasn't born in the Depression. It had been military and institutional food since the late 19th century. But the Depression made it a civilian staple. Glass jars of dried, thinly sliced beef were shelf-stable and relatively affordable. A white sauce made from flour, butter, and milk took 5 minutes. Poured over toast, it was a hot, protein-containing meal that cost almost nothing. Working-class families across the country adopted it throughout the 1930s as a reliable weekday dinner. Diner menus featured it for 15 or 20 cents. School cafeterias served it on Fridays. It was honest, straightforward food, not trying to be anything it wasn't. The dish's military nickname, SOS, became the name most Americans eventually knew it by. But before the war gave it that name, it was simply Depression food. Something hot on the table when hot on the table was all you could promise. Number 8. Oatmeal cake. Butter was expensive. Eggs were expensive. But oats were cheap, and Depression-era bakers discovered that soaking rolled oats in boiling water and folding them into cake batter produced something that required less of everything else while delivering a moist, dense, deeply satisfying result. The oats, once softened, provided structure, moisture, and a subtle sweetness that reduced the sugar needed. Topped with a simple glaze of brown sugar and whatever nuts were available, it came out of the oven looking and smelling like something that belonged on a better table than most Depression families were sitting at. It was one of the dishes that genuinely improved on what it replaced. The texture of a properly made oatmeal cake, dense but tender, with a chew regular cake doesn't have, is distinct and memorable. Families that made it during the Depression continued making it afterward, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Number 7. Bean soup. Dried beans were the Depression's most important protein source. Cheap, shelf-stable for months, and calorie-dense enough to sustain a working adult through a full day. Bean soup, in its Depression-era form, was typically dried red kidney beans or navy beans, soaked overnight, simmered with onion and whatever scraps of meat were available, a ham hock, a bacon rind, until the beans were soft and the broth had thickened naturally. Idaho Senator Fred Dubois was so convinced of bean soup's essential American status that he passed legislation mandating it appear on the Senate restaurant menu every single day, a tradition that continued for decades. The soup that fed Depression-era families, from Idaho farmhouses to New York tenements, was deemed important enough to become a permanent fixture of the United States Senate cafeteria. It still appears there today. Number 6. Depression cake. When butter, eggs, and milk became unaffordable, bakers improvised. Depression cake, also called wacky cake or crazy cake, eliminated expensive ingredients entirely. No eggs, no butter, no milk. Instead, flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, vinegar, vegetable oil, and water. The vinegar reacts with the baking soda to create lift, replacing the aeration that eggs normally provide. The vegetable oil replaces butter's fat. The result is a chocolate cake that is, by any objective measure, genuinely good. Moist, tender, with a clean chocolate flavor. Food chemists studying the recipe decades later found that the vinegar baking soda reaction produces a lighter, more even crumb than butter-based cakes in some conditions. Depression-era bakers stumbled onto a technique through necessity that professional bakers would later deliberately adopt. This cake didn't just survive the Depression. It changed baking. Number 5. Corned beef hash. Canned corned beef was cheap. Potatoes were cheap. Together, they became one of the Depression-era's most reliable and genuinely satisfying meals. Shredded canned corned beef combined with chopped cooked potatoes, pressed into a hot greased skillet, cooked without stirring until the bottom forms a dark, crispy crust. That browned bottom layer concentrates flavor through caramelization in a way the ingredients alone don't suggest is possible. Diners across Depression-era America served corned beef hash for as little as 15 cents. It appeared at breakfast alongside eggs and as a standalone dinner at night. It was one of those Depression dishes that crossed into the mainstream permanently. You can still order it at diners from coast to coast, though fewer people do every decade. Number 4. Potato soup. On the nights when there was truly nothing, no meat, no canned goods left on the shelf, there were potatoes. There were almost always potatoes. And potatoes, with enough water and salt, became soup. Depression-era potato soup at its most basic was sliced boiled potatoes in salted water, with a small amount of butter stirred in at the end. On better nights it included milk, making it closer to a chowder. On the hardest nights, it was just potatoes and water and the determination to put something hot on the table. What elevates this dish in memory isn't the recipe. It's what it represented. The potato soup of the Depression years was an act of love, made from almost nothing. Every family that made it was saying the same thing without words. We're still here. We're still eating together. We're going to be okay. Number 3. Apple Brown Betty. Before the Depression, Apple Brown Betty was already an established American dessert. Apples layered with buttered breadcrumbs, sugar, and cinnamon, baked until golden. During the Depression, it transformed. The butter became whatever fat was available. The breadcrumbs came from stale bread that would otherwise have been wasted. The apples were sometimes stretched with other fruit to make them go further. What's remarkable is how good it still was. The technique of layering fruit with starch and fat and applying heat is one of the most reliable flavor-building methods in all of cooking. Even with substitutions, the result was warm, sweet, fragrant, and filling. a dessert that made a hard week feel survivable. It appeared at church potlucks, at community meals, at family tables across the economic spectrum during the 1930s. After prosperity returned, fancier desserts reclaimed the table. The Brown Betty retreated to grandmother's recipe cards. It deserves better than that. Number 2. Hominy. Hominy, dried maize kernels treated with an alkaline solution to remove the hull, had been a staple of Native American cooking for centuries before European contact. Early American colonists adopted it as a survival food. Then, as American food culture became wealthier and more varied, it largely disappeared from northern and urban tables. The Depression brought it back. Canned hominy was widely available, extremely affordable, and nutritionally significant. The nixtamalization process that creates hominy actually increases the bioavailability of its niacin content, making it more nutritious than untreated corn. Brands like Stokely's hominy were staples on Depression-era pantry shelves. The flavor is distinctive, starchy, slightly earthy, with a chew somewhere between a dumpling and a soft potato. After the Depression, it retreated once again to southern and southwestern kitchens. Pozole, the Mexican-American hominy stew increasingly popular today, is a reminder that hominy never needed saving. It just needed rediscovering. Number 1. Cabbage water broth. We end with the most honest dish on this list. Not a recipe, not a technique. Just a pot of water that had been used to boil cabbage, kept and served as soup. Cabbage water broth appeared during the absolute depths of the Depression, 1932 and 1933, when even the cheapest foods had become difficult to afford regularly. The water left over from cooking cabbage retained starch, minerals, and enough of the vegetable's flavor to be more than plain hot water. Thickened with stale bread, seasoned with salt, sometimes enriched with a spoonful of grease, it was served as soup in households that had nothing left to add. Food historians who documented Depression-era eating through the Federal Writers Project, oral histories collected from ordinary Americans between 1936 and 1940, found cabbage water broth mentioned again and again, not with shame, but with a matter-of-fact directness that is harder to read than shame would be. This is what we ate. It was hot. It was something. Of all the dishes that vanished when prosperity returned, this one's disappearance is the one we should be most grateful for, and most determined never to forget. Because a country that remembers what its people survived doesn't take for granted what they eventually built. 20 dishes, 20 windows into what America looked like during its hardest years. What strikes me most, looking at all of them together, isn't the poverty. It's the ingenuity. The creativity that came out of genuine desperation. The dignity that people maintained at the table, even when the table had almost nothing on it. These dishes vanished because the people who made them wanted them to vanish. They built a better America, specifically so their children wouldn't have to know what cabbage water tasted like. And their children built something even better, so their grandchildren wouldn't have to know either. But forgetting isn't the same as honoring. And understanding where American food came from, all of it, not just the celebrated parts, is how we actually respect the people who built what we inherited. If a dish on this list reminded you of something a grandparent mentioned, drop it in the comments. Those stories matter. Like this video if you think they do. And subscribe, because tomorrow we keep going.